Do you allow me to share silly stories with you? I'm going to do it anyway. This is Mother's Day, and this is sort of a Mother's Day story. An older mother had raised 3 sons and raised them to where they were very successful. And it was Mother's Day, and the 3 sons said to themselves, it would be nice at this time in Mom's life that we gave her something nice for Mother's Day. And the first son said, I know what I want to give her. She lives in that real tiny apartment. And I think, knowing where she's lived most of her life, I am going to build her a big house where she will have plenty of room for the rest of her life. And the second son said, well, I know Mom has trouble getting around. And I know all of the rickety cars we had in our growing up days. So I am going to buy Mom a nice Mercedes automobile and provide her with a chauffeur so that she can live out her life in that way. And the third son smiled and said, I've got you both beat. You remember how Mom enjoyed reading the Bible? And you know she can't see very well. So I am sending her a remarkable parrot that recites the entire book. It took elders in the church 12 years to teach him. He's one of a kind. Mama just has to name the chapter and verse, and the parrot recites it. Soon thereafter, Mom sent out a letter of thanks to all of her sons. To the first, she said, David, the house you built for me is so huge. And remember, I only live in one room. But now I have to clean the whole house. And the second son, she said, John, you know I'm getting too old to travel. I stay home most of the time. So I rarely use the Mercedes. And the driver is so rude. And to the third son, she wrote, Dearest Jeffrey, you have the good sense to know what your mother likes. The chicken was delicious. I told you that was a dumb story. Oh, well. That wasn't our sermon. Our sermon today is entitled, A Blessing in Waiting. How many people really believe that there is a blessing in waiting? Not too many. I got 2 or 3 nodded their head. And the reason the rest of you don't believe there's a blessing in waiting is because you don't like to wait. I should know by now, after all the years, my training period in waiting with 4 daughters, a wife and 4 daughters and a granddaughter, and now 3 granddaughters and the great ones and all of them. I've had plenty of experience in waiting in many aspects of family life. In fact, our one daughter is with us here today, Charlene. Number 3. When they call on the phone, I say, is this 1, 2, 3, or 4? They have names, but the most notable thing, a notable thing about the daughter that is with us today is that when she graduated in 1976 from high school, her dad graduated from Knox College in Galesburg the same year. I decided to go back and get my BA and do some sub-teaching, and I'm so glad that she never wanted to share report cards. But we're glad to have her with us today. Waiting and patience is a virtue. I've never felt virtuous along those lines because I'm not a good waiter. In fact, when I go to the doctor's office, if I have a 2 o'clock appointment, there's been times that I wondered if it was AM or PM. And you don't mind waiting so much, but all the people that are there waiting with you are not people who are well, they are people who are ill, or they would not be there in the first place. And some of them are so willing to share with you their medical history. And if that's not bad enough, you pick up a magazine and see that it's 2 years old. Now, why doctors could never afford to get publications that are up to date, I don't know. Maybe their patients take those home. But Gary read for us this morning 2 portions of Scripture, one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament. The one in the Old Testament said, and there's a promise connected to both of them, they who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. I'm sorry. Is that better? Why didn't you tell me to do that 15 minutes ago? Rita's been glaring at me ever since she sat back here. Okay. All right. Both scriptures have a promise. They who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. We are people who come to church every Sunday, and one of the reasons we come to church is that our strength might be renewed. Not our physical strength, although there's times when it needs to be renewed, but we come to get our spiritual batteries recharged, right? They who wait upon the Lord, those who are not impatient, shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, walk and not be faint. That's who we are. A blessing in waiting. There are times when I recognize that my impatience really is nothing compared to what a lot of people have gone through over the years. And they would keep wondering, how long, Lord? How long? How much longer do we have to be patient? Remember the cry that God heard from the Israelites back in Moses' day? They were slaves and had been slaves for many years. And finally, the Bible said that God heard their cry. And he answered their prayer. And one of the things that we recognize is how grateful the Israelite people were that God heard and answered their prayer. And Jesus and his disciples honored the goodness of God by gathering in Jerusalem on the week before he was crucified. And on that Thursday, they went to an upper room and they observed a special meal. It was called Passover. It was in celebration of the death angel passing over the firstborn of the Israelites, where the blood was on the doorpost, and the firstborn of the Israelites were spared. But you remember the story, even the firstborn of the king, the Pharaoh, was slain. And that was such a significant thing in the life of the nation of Israel that even to this very day, the feast of Passover is celebrated. Because God heard their anguish cry and he answered their prayer. Their patience in trusting God paid off. That was the Passover feast. Now, we're going to talk about two feasts before I finish today. There's three feasts altogether that really, there's more. Israelites were good at, Israelites are almost like the Presbyterians. They really like to feast. The second feast after Passover was the Feast of Pentecost. That's next Sunday. I'm going to let Joni, I'm going to let Joni expound on that one there. That's her story. The Feast of Pentecost was 50 days after the Feast of Passover. Pente, you scholars, Pente is 50th. When Jesus was crucified and buried, how glad we are that he didn't stay buried. He rose from the dead. And he appeared then to his followers for how many days? 40 days. Giving you a little lesson this morning, folks. 40 days. Oh my, he appeared to different groups, and 200 at one time. So that no one with any right thinking would have any doubt about Jesus rising from the dead. But at the end of the 40 days, I think it's what we celebrate today. It's what we refer to as Ascension Sunday. At the end of 40 days, he gathered them around him and he gave them one last little exhortation about what he expected. And Gary read those words to us. I know, guys, you're ready to go. Remember they had heard, go into all the world and preach the gospel? And Jesus said, all those things that you have seen me do and heard me say, you will do even greater things. And boy, if that didn't charge their batteries, they were just ready to go. But now the very last thing he says to them, I want you to go to Jerusalem and I want you to wait. That wasn't a part of their vocabulary. Waiting wasn't something that they were ready to do. They were ready to go. Places to go, things to do, people to see. How many are like that? That's in our makeup. And then he ascended. And Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, and all of them, they stood around, well, what are we going to do? And I can just hear the discussion. Peter saying, well, let's go catch fish. Let's do something. And John, probably the wisest of them all, said, now guys, wait a minute. What did Jesus say that we should do? He said that we should go to Jerusalem and wait for a promise. 40 days, and Pentecost is 50 days. So now, if my math is correct, they're going to go to Jerusalem, and they're going to wait how long? Approximately 10 days. In a big room with a bunch of women praying and sharing recipes and all that good stuff. I can imagine the fishermen were mortified that was their call. But they obeyed. Because you see, obedience is the key word to all of this taking place. Had they not done what Jesus asked them to do, they would have missed Pentecost. But they were there in Jerusalem waiting and praying for the blessing that was to come. I think one of the most poignant stories that came out of World War II was a book I read it's quite a while ago, about a young man that was getting ready to go overseas. And he would be gone from his sweetheart for 2 years. They'd been dating steady, and they had their last night together, and it was very, very tearful. And he said to her, honey, will you wait for me? And she said, yes, I will wait, and I will be faithful. And so she waited. And the 2 years passed. And there were trials and tribulations and temptations. And finally, he came back home and found that his sweetheart was faithfully waiting. Now, you thought I was going to tell a different story, didn't you? And there are different stories that could be told. And she was faithful to her promise, and there was a blessing for both of them. I'm not going to say what happened on the day of Pentecost, but because that's Joni's. I don't want to she's going to do that next Sunday, okay? But I just want to say to us today, God has called us into a lifetime of service. And part of that lifetime of service is simply in waiting. And we need to be patient. We are waiting for a new minister. And some of you have been not the most patient people in the world. Come on now. I want a new pastor, and I want him now. That's who we are. But there is a blessing in waiting for the promise. One last thought. Does God keep his promises? Is God a promise keeper? We know all about promise breakers, but God is a promise keeper. Whatever He says in His Word, He will do. He will keep His promise. We can take that to the bank. We can count on it. And we are recipients of God's promises today. May you leave rejoicing today. May your Mother's Day lunch just be so fulfilling, even if you have to pick up the ticket. May it be a blessing to you, one and all. Thank you for allowing me to share these words with you today. Amen.